Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyleranzmannperformance. So today we're going to talk about a specific training method. It's called Accentuated Eccentric Loading. And so what it is, it's basically when you load the eccentric portion of a movement heavier than the following concentric portion of that movement. It has a lot of benefits, which we'll eventually talk about, but first we need to give some background on eccentric actions. So eccentric actions are lengthening actions. So if we think about, for example, like with a biceps curl, right? When we're lowering the weight, that's an eccentric action of the biceps, right? When we're raising it, it's a concentric action, and that is a shortening action. When we are not moving at all, but we're like pushing against like an immovable object, if I did this against a rack or something, that would be an isometric action. Okay, so eccentric actions, what are the benefits here? Well, they're more metabolically efficient than concentric actions. They produce greater force, likely to because of a reduced cross-bridge detachment. And they can store elastic energy. So what kind of happens is we increase the output when an eccentric action is paired with a concentric action to follow. Think about kind of the difference between your squat jump, where you just start at the bottom, you're dead stopped, and then you come out of it, versus a counter movement jump where you drop down and then come up. That kind of pre-stretch, or that storing of elastic energy we get from that counter movement provides greater output during that concentric portion. So dedicated eccentric training provides some different benefits than your typical kind of concentric training would provide. So one of them is that we can actually get greater improvements in strength, right? Like we kind of talked about up here, we can produce more force via an eccentric action than we can a concentric action. So if we think about like a deadlift, we can lower more weight towards the ground than we can actually pick up off the ground. So we can handle heavier weights, we can get greater strength improvements, and that kind of goes into our next point. So we can also get greater muscle hypertrophy. All right, so what's kind of happening here is we may actually create more muscle damage as well. So we may get more DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, and things like that. So that has some implications for kind of later on when we're talking about when to actually use this method. The next piece is we can shift the length-tension relationship, right? So the length-tension relationship, I've touched on this in other articles like the upper body plyometrics article. But what kind of happens is there's a specific range of muscle lengths where the muscle can produce the greatest force. And then past that length, whether it's shorter or longer, we get what's called a descending force curve. So it's producing less and less force. It can still produce force, but less than in its optimal range. So what can happen is if we shift the length-tension relationship to longer muscle lengths, we can take advantage of getting more elastic energy storage and utilization, right? Because obviously this muscle has a specific length-tension relationship like we've talked about. But the elastic components, right, the more they're stretched, the greater rebound effect we're going to get from that. So if we can shift this to a longer muscle length for an optimal force production, we're going to get a greater benefit of elastic energy there. So that's a plus. The other thing is we can increase the contractile speed of the fibers. We can increase the number of sarcomeres in series in the fascicle length. So the sarcomeres in series has an implication for not only possibly the contractile speed of the fibers along with the fascicle length, but also may have implications for injury resistance, right? So if we have more sarcomeres in series, it may kind of reduce the instance of muscle pulls and things like that. It may also reduce the inhibition from the Golgi tendon organ. So if we kind of think about the GTO as like the governor on a motor, what's going to happen is basically when it senses a muscle producing too much force, it shuts it off and relaxes it. So if we can kind of raise the level at which that happens, we're going to be able to produce more force. So that's another plus with this method. Okay, so now we can actually get to accentuated eccentric loading. So like we talked about in the beginning, it's basically when we load the eccentric portion heavier than the concentric portion. All right, so we know that we're stronger through eccentric actions than concentric actions, okay? So that can provide some obvious benefits in terms of strength, but we can also get some benefits in terms of power and explosiveness depending on how we choose to load this, all right? So rather than any old eccentric training, one of the benefits of accentuated eccentric loading is that we get that immediate concentric action following the eccentric action, right? This is kind of how we play in sports, how we run, jump, throw, whatever. It's not like we're just going through an eccentric action and then stopping, right? We need to immediately follow that with a concentric action in order to derive benefit from the elastic energy stored in that kind of pre-stretch that we're getting there, right? There's a time limit here based on how long those cross bridges are going to stay attached, okay? So depending on the method used will kind of depend on the adaptations that we're going after, all right? So if we're going after more strength, and we already have a guy who's pretty strong, supra-maximal loading may be appropriate. So that means it's going to be heavier than your concentric 1RM. Okay, so what'll happen is we'll load the weight releasers or something along those lines heavier than 100% 1RM, and then we'll drop off whatever amount of weight during the concentric portion. All right, so basically when you hit the bottom portion, those weights will come off and you'll be able to lift it on your own. Whereas if we were doing eccentric training where it's just super maximal overload, you come down, let's say you're squatting, you come down into a power rack, right? You stop on the power rack, you've done 1 rep, that's awesome, super overloading, but now you've got to unload the weights, rack it back up yourself, and we didn't get the benefit of kind of that immediate concentric action following the eccentric action, so we really haven't effectively trained the stretch shortening cycle. So the way you choose to load these movements should really depend on the athlete that you're working with, right? So super maximal loading is really reserved for super advanced, very strong athletes, because what's happening is because that is so overloading, right? It's something that we can't even lift on our own concentrically. Fatigue sets in very rapidly. So for less trained athletes, they may never even see a potentiating benefit from that. And even for very trained athletes, fatigue is going to set in pretty quickly, so your reps are going to need to be very low. If we're working on training strength, it seems like the range for kind of loading the eccentric portion of that movement should be 80% or above, right? Like I said, anything super maximal, very advanced athletes, but even for lesser trained athletes like the intermediates and maybe the late stage beginners, this could be used if your loading was carefully chosen. And kind of along with that 80+% eccentric loading, we want something 70% or above for the concentric portion. If we're talking about in that power range, we want something still probably 75 to 85% in the eccentric portion, 55 to 80% in the concentric range. If we're talking about power, explosive, ballistic plyometric movements, we're talking about 30% or less, right? So a lot of the research kind of suggests that if we get much heavier than that, we start to change the movement to the point where the amortization phase becomes too long, the range of motion becomes too great. We're no longer biomechanically efficient in this movement anymore, so we're not actually deriving any benefit from kind of overloading that eccentric portion. We're just no longer potentiating the concentric stuff, right? Because we know that when we're overloading that eccentric portion or loading it heavier than the concentric portion, the way we potentiate it is by increasing the load or the speed of the eccentric action. But if we do either past the point of what an individual athlete can handle, right, they get shut off by GTOs, muscle spindles, things along those lines. So we need to kind of be careful with the athlete that we're working with and kind of choosing our loading based on their needs and ability levels. Okay. The other piece with this is that it should really change as we go through our off season and when we get into our in season. So unless we have a really, really well trained athlete, so like we're talking about a starting pitcher who's at the professional level, very strong, very powerful, that kind of thing, we may be able to use some AEL in season, but this would be kind of reserved for, like, let's say, the day after their start kind of thing. All right, we're not going to be using a whole lot of this much closer to their next outing. All right, because again, the DOMs are kind of a risk here, and in season we're worried about kind of maintaining performance, not really increasing it as we go. The risk just isn't worth the reward there. All right, and as the off season progresses, we kind of change the load based on what we're working towards. So if we have a force deficient athlete, so a velocity dominant guy, we're going to be working more on strength in the early portion of the off season and more on that higher velocity portion as we get later in the off season, because we're trying to just kind of raise their performance level as we go. As we get closer to the season, we want them doing stuff they're good at, because that's what's going to lead to the best outcome on the field. All right, but early in the off season, we work on their weaknesses. And for a velocity deficient athlete, it's basically the opposite. So earlier in the off season, after we've built an effective kind of work capacity base and maybe somewhat of a strength base, we're going to go into that plyometric and ballistic stuff, and we'll work the heavier stuff in a higher ratio as we go through the off season. Okay, so accentuated eccentric loading, we can use weight releasers, manual resistance, bands, or we can drop dumbbells. It really depends on what we're trying to do, which of these we're going to use, right? Weight releases are really good for your barbell movements and your heavier loading stuff, because we can put a lot of weight on there. Manual resistance works pretty well for push-ups and dumbbell movements if you have enough control to kind of use it for those. Bands and dropped dumbbells work really well for kind of your jumping, your plyometric, and some ballistic variations, because they allow you to kind of let go of it when you get to the bottom portion of that eccentric before you transition to that concentric movement. So again, goals, athlete, time of the off season, they'll kind of determine what method is used, if we use it at all, and kind of how we load said method. And that's basically it for accentuated eccentric loading. If you got any questions, drop them in the comments. And until next time.